RIOT. A man described by Jack Smith as a Trump campaign employee, agent, and co-conspirator. His identity redacted, replaced by the ID number P5, informs a colleague on the ground at the vote counting on election night 2020 in Detroit. Make them riot. Do it. Do it with 3 exclamation points. The full paragraph from the Jack Smith Opus number 1 revealed yesterday reads, on November 4th, P5, a campaign employee, agent, and co-conspirator of the defendant, tried to sow confusion when the ongoing vote count at the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan looked unfavorable for the defendant. There, when a colleague at the TCF Center told P5, we think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right, P5 responded, find a reason it isn't. Give me options to file litigation, and even if it is sick, meaning even if it is. When the colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, a violent effort to stop the vote count in Florida after the 2000 presidential election, P5 responded, make them riot and do it! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. It's 165 pages of that. You open the file and the treason falls out and covers you like dust from the top of your bookshelf. All the evidence you need to prove Trump is guilty of knowingly trying to subvert the election and now knowingly trying to pretend he was just asking the kind of good questions any good president would when there was evidence of a crooked vote somewhere. Quoting again, contrary to the defendant's public claims of victory immediately following Election Day, his advisors informed him that he would likely lose. On November 7th, in a private campaign meeting that included P2, P3, P4, and White House staffer P9, who came to serve as a conduit for information from the campaign to the defendant, campaign staff told the defendant that he had only a slim chance of prevailing in the election and that any potential success was contingent on the defendant winning all ongoing vote counts or litigation in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Within a week of that assessment, on November 13th, the defendant's campaign conceded its litigation in Arizona, meaning that based on his campaign advisor's previous assessment, the defendant had lost the election. November 13th. I suggested here last Friday that a particular Trump post had given us a preview of Jack Smith's tack, that there must have been some tip-off to his lawyers, that what was in the Smith submission to Judge Chutkan, and that Trump was now scrambling to disprove what must have been Smith's basic premise, that from the beginning Trump knew he had lost, and thus everything he did for which he is now charged, he did as a private citizen, as a candidate, as a politician, as a criminal. Not as a president, no matter how immune a corrupt Supreme Court would try to make him. That Trump post read, shocking breaking news as exposed by the great John Solomon and the great work of Congressman Barry Loudermilk and the Republicans on the House Oversight Committee. The deep state chose to disregard my direct authorization of at least 10,000 National Guard troops to ensure that Washington, D.C. was safe and secure on January 6, 2021. These deep state subversives disobeyed the president's directives, which would have prevented any unrest that day. January 6th, as it is known, would never have taken place. Not only that, the deep state betrayed me nonsense, but Trump also again brought up his lie about Nancy Pelosi and troops that night in his spasm in front of some microphones at Trump Tower. And one of Trump's top ass kissers, Joe Kernan of CNBC, had said, quote, in the heat of that moment, at that point, I think he really did believe that it had been stolen. At that point, I don't know if he believes it anymore. If Jack Smith's tack is that Trump knew all along he lost, and that everything afterwards, literally everything after November 4th, was insurrection or an attempted alibi for insurrection, Trump had to quickly revive the idea that he was just following the clues, just serving the nation just out there presidenting his big ass off. Having Trump staffer and operative P5 trying to start a riot at the vote counting in Detroit, not on January 6th, but on November 4th, kind of puts the bullet from a smoking gun through the heart of the "I was just presidenting" argument. So who is P5? There actually seems to be an answer. It would be nice if it were Rudy Giuliani. It's not. He's got a different number. Or Roger Stone or somebody like that. But in fact, the consensus is it's a Trump dirty trickster named Mike Roman. The gadfly Jay Quo wrote last December that Jack Smith had filed a 404B notice in his case against Trump about evidence probably not included in the charges that still went to Trump's motive or his, quote, propensity to commit crimes, and that the 404B notice pertained to a Trump campaign employee trying to start a riot at the counting center in Detroit on election night. Quote noted that in June last year, CNN had reported that Mike Roman was cooperating with federal prosecutors in their pursuit of Trump. Just so happens Mike Roman posted a video from the Detroit count of quote-unquote challengers being ejected from the vote count. Just so happens Roman isn't some peripheral figure in Trump world. In 2016, he was Trump's chief watcher of the poll sites. In 2020, he worked on the fake electors scheme. In 2022, he was indicted in Arizona, in Georgia, in Wisconsin. Check his closets. See if he has any shirts with P5 monogrammed in the collars. As I said, metaphorically turn to any page in the Smith filing and treason will fall off the shelf and hit you in the effing head. There's Mr. P5, even before the election was called for Joe Biden, to indicate just how soon Trump campaign staff knew it was over and just how soon Trump campaign staff turned to violence. For a little grotesque snapshot of the brutality and the disregard for the country, though, and the Constitution and human life, there are the stars of a little later in the story on page 142. The defendant further revealed the private nature of his desperate conduct as a candidate rather than a president in an exchange that the government does not plan to use at trial he had with aide P15 shortly after the 2:24 p.m. tweet on January 6th. Upon receiving a phone call alerting him that Vice President Mike Pence had been taken to a secure location, P15 rushed to the dining room to inform the defendant in hopes that the defendant would take action to ensure Pence's safety. Instead, after P15 delivered the news, the defendant looked at him and said only, "So what?" Just to give a little context as to what Trump was doing all that day, Smith now has Trump's phone log and witness accounts. He has a play-by-play of Trump attorney Kenny the Cheese, Ken Chesbro, ordered by Trump to come to D.C. for January 6th, actually going so far as Trump's proxy as to have, quote, marched with the crowd to the Capitol and breached the restricted area surrounding the building. As the nation teeters on chaos, Trump himself is in the White House dining room. Fox News is on the monitor. Trump is on his phone scrolling through Twitter. Smith has all of Trump's tweets, and so what? Everybody's had those. He's had them analyzed textually, and in the filing, Jack Smith asserts they are proven private conduct, not presidential actions. Quote, the phone's activity logs show that the defendant was using his phone and in particular using the Twitter application consistently throughout the day after he returned from the ellipse speech. Then there is a different kind of activity log. Jack Smith says he has previously undisclosed evidence of countless interactions between Trump and Vice President Pence, which he then outlines. A call between the defendant and Pence on November 7th, the day that media organizations began to project Biden as the winner of the election. Pence tried to encourage the defendant as a friend, reminding him, you took a dying political party and gave it a new lease on life. A November 11th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff during which Pence asked when most of the lawsuits would be resolved. When does this come to a head, unquote? And the campaign staff responded, the week after Thanksgiving. A November 12th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff during which Pence recalls the campaign lawyers gave a sober and somewhat pessimistic report on the state of election challenges. A private lunch on November 12th in which Pence reiterated a face-saving option for the defendant. Don't concede, but recognize process is over. A private lunch on November 16th in which Pence tried to encourage the defendant to accept the results of the election and run again in 2024, to which the defendant responded, I don't know, 2024 is so far off. A November 23rd phone call in which the defendant told Pence that the defendant's private attorney, P76, was not optimistic about the election challenges. A December 21st private lunch in which Pence encouraged the defendant, quote, not to look at the election as a loss, just an intermission. This was followed later in the day by a private discussion in the Oval Office in which the defendant asked Pence, what do you think we should do? Pence said, after we have exhausted every legal process in the courts and Congress, if we still come up short, the defendant should take a bow. It's not a loss, it's an intermission. They're not jeering you. They're saying boo-ump. And what happened after all this? After Pence turned his hair white trying to convince Trump, quote, on December 28th, CC2, that's co-conspirator, co-conspirator 5, and co-conspirator 6 exchanged text messages in which CC2 expressed concern that Gohmert versus Pence, a lawsuit filed that day before they asserted that Pence had the discretion to choose electoral votes during the certification proceeding, would prompt a federal court to publicly reject and thus preclude the plan that the conspirators were advancing in private. Thereafter, at 11 a.m. on January 1st, the defendant called Pence to berate him because he had learned that Pence had filed a brief opposing the relief sought in Gohmert. When Pence explained, as he had before, that he did not believe that he had the power under the Constitution to decide which votes to accept, the defendant told him that, quote, hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts, and people are going to think you're stupid, and berated him pointedly. You're too honest. I will never admire Mike Pence, and I will never forgive him. And while I suppose I would immunize him for the trial, I will never say he did what the vice president of the United States should have done at that time, as opposed to, say, the vice president of the Republican Party, which was to go public with these events as they happened and secure the nation and thus himself. But I will confess it is almost poignant to see how long Mike Pence thought he could somehow find a human being inside Donald Trump's body. He must have still been trying when word got to him that some of Trump's supporters were out there outside the Capitol building and building the gallows just for him. Still, the Pence quotes are not nearly as satisfying as the Amy Coney Barrett quote. That's right, Amy Coney Barrett. Why, that's Amy Coney Barrett's name. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the Trump appointee. Smith's point number 2. Even if the conduct were deemed official, the government could rebut the presumption of immunity. In any event, even if the defendant's efforts to convene fraudulent electors could be considered official, the presumption would be rebutted because, quote, a president has no legal authority and thus no official capacity to influence how the states appoint their electors, unquote, and accordingly there is, quote, no plausible argument for barring prosecution of that alleged conduct. Barrett, J., concurring in part. While Congress has a limited role in the appointment of presidential electors, the president has none. The case, and each part of the case, and each page of the Smith filing, the case against Trump is inarguable. It is moral and thorough and legally impervious, and of course none of that matters anymore. Because the point of Donald Trump is to enable individual human beings in this country to behave as if they were themselves corporations, to behave as if right or wrong, innocence or guilt, responsibility or subversion, or any other questions of the morality of an individual's personal conduct is irrelevant. That there are only two emotions remaining in the world: greed and a calculation about how much of this I can get away with. There may never be a Trump trial because a Trump election would erase the chance of it, and with that would erase the entirety of justice in the United States of America, and with that erase the entirety of the United States of America. Perhaps worse yet, a Trump election might lead to everything in Smith's filing being addressed in some kind of sham trial somewhere, in which the Supreme Court, or whoever would replace Jack Smith and Tonya Chutkan when Trump disappears them, would go through each of these 165 pages and call everything P5 did official and subject to presidential immunity, and state everything Mike Pence said communications with His Majesty President Trump, which may not be quoted on penalty of death. In the real United States of America, the one we still have, this is enough for anybody who reads it to demand not just that Trump be tried and convicted and imprisoned for life, but that even at this late date, right now, he be removed from the presidential ballot by any legal means available. The problem is the real United States has already been damaged enough by Trump and Vance and Pence and the Supreme Court and every last one of them that such a moral, patriotic action is virtually impossible even now. And if Harris and Walz lose on November 5th, it will be utterly impossible thereafter. If Harris and Walz lose on November 5th, it will be utterly impossible thereafter unless. With a day to think about it, I'm beginning to doubt I really understand now what J.D. Vance was doing during that vice presidential debate. Oh, he lied. He foretold an America dedicated to prejudice, hatred, superstition. He looked, as I said, like an Amway salesman in eyeliner. But he rejected, if not Trump, certainly, then he rejected Trump's entire persona. His entire reason for being, the hatred that fuels Trump and so many who are enslaved to Trump. At first glance, it sounded like a good way of selling the Trump agenda to those rejecting it out of hand because of the stink of the Trump perversions. But at the core here, Trump is insane. And with each passing day, it is evident that his paranoia and his delusions of grandeur and his conviction that he is omnipotent and perfect, these things are increasing. Why would Trump ever go along with something like that performance by J.D. Vance that did not serve to sell the fiction of Trump perfection? Did J.D. Vance freelance that part? I'm going to have to think this one through long and hard, but I wonder if J.D. Vance revealed a side hustle during the vice presidential debate. Could he be potentially running a coup against Trump? I don't mean something before the election. I mean a coup with multiple landing points in the future in which it could be Vance who takes over the Trump cult if Trump is beaten. Takes it over if Trump really meant what he said about not running again if he loses. Takes it over by force even if Trump doesn't mean that. The great gaping hole in the entire decade-long Trump conspiracy is that there is nobody there to succeed him. His children are idiots. The congressmen are all Derek Van Orden and Clay Higgins. And they all fail the central casting test in a different way. The other option, of course, is that if Trump wins, do you really think, having watched him, that this Vance would hesitate to lead a palace revolt to, at some point next year, 2026, 2027, to invoke the 25th Amendment the moment Trump starts speaking in tongues or he falls over during a speech or he gets pushed over during a speech? We have a lot of poll numbers about that debate now, and they divide into three categories. The first is a true interior number. CNN asked how many who watched felt the debate had led them to change their minds about which ticket they would vote for, and the total was 1%. Since the television ratings have come in at 43,200,000 viewers, 1% of that is 432,000 voters. Sounds kind of high, actually. 432,000 votes is a lot. Until you realize that the 1% that changed their minds counts those who were voting for Trump and are now voting for Harris, and those who were voting for Harris and are now voting for Trump. Even if they split 60-40 towards Trump, say, the net impact would be that Trump gained 86,000 votes. Like the maximum theoretical change last debate of the series, 86,000 votes. Second poll number, who won? Nearly all polling by everybody showed a tie or a virtual tie. The CBS poll was literally 41-41 with 18% undecided. But to employ the old cliche, the game was not as close as the score suggested because virtually all of the interior numbers favored Tim Walz. If needed, are they prepared to be president? Prepared, Walz, 60%, not prepared, 40%. Vance, prepared, 55%, not prepared, 45%. That's a 20-10 difference. Who did a better job talking about abortion? Walz, 62-38. About health care? Walz, 59-41. About conflict in the Middle East? Tied. About the economy? Vance by 2 points. About immigration? Vance by 4 points. The sell of the Trump campaign, economy and immigration. Vance only outpolled Walz by a total of 6 percentage points. There is no question Vance lowered his unfavorables Tuesday night. That was the idea. He's now at 49-47. He's above water. But Walz lowered his unfavorables too. He was 52-41 before the debate per CBS. That was plus 11. And afterwards he was 60-35, plus 25, plus 25. The CNN poll, asking the same question, now has Walz at 59% favorable and only 22% unfavorable. That's plus 37. Who in the hell is plus 37 anymore? I mean, do we need to talk about making Tim Walz the presidential nominee? I mean, can you do that? Could you somehow, someday promote the vice presidential nominee and make them the presidential? Oh, never mind. Also of interest here, Vance's whiny complaint about the rules where you guys weren't going to fact check did not universally go viral. But at least nobody with a reputation to uphold took his side when the moderators cut him off for lying about the Haitian Ohioans. Well, I guess I'm going to have to define reputation, because there is somebody who was once actually entrusted with a primetime hour on CNN who is insisting that Vance was right and the moderators were wrong. That's next. This is Countdown.
This is Countdown with Keith Olbermann.
because on this edition of Countdown, I saw her on TV somewhere recently, and then somebody actually mentioned him yesterday to me. We used to go skiing with him. We're not friends with him anymore. And I flashed back to the day that featured both of them. The day that was the greatest fall off from possibility to reality in my life so far. Because the day I die will be worse. Him? He was the guy who ran the Countdown project at Current TV into the ground. I tried to hire Maddow and Hayes. He hired Cenk Uygur. She? For once, I'm going to talk about somebody I did not go out on a date with. Uma Thurman. And things I promised not to tell coming up. First, there are still more new idiots to talk about in the daily roundup of the miscreants, morons, and Dunning-Kruger effect specimens who constitute today's worst persons in the world. LeBron's worst, Diamond Sports, and Major League Baseball. Baseball playoffs started on TV day before yesterday, so naturally, exactly what baseball wants right now is stories about how at least 8 of its team's telecasts next year just got canceled by the TV company that was supposedly going to carry them. Oops. It's Diamond, part of Sinclair Broadcasting, the part that operates the Bally regional sports networks that took over when ESPN bought out the Fox regional sports networks, and then ESPN said, what in the hell did we do that for? And during the endless court hearings about the bankruptcy of Diamond, yesterday, the lawyer for Diamond suddenly announced that of its remaining dozen contracts with big league clubs, it will only actually pursue and broadcast the games of one of them, the Atlanta Braves. So Anaheim, Cincinnati, Detroit, Kansas City, Miami, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Tampa Bay, right now you don't have TV carriers for next year, even though each of the teams thought they had contracts with Diamond. There were already 3 teams without deals for 2025, Cleveland, Minnesota, and Texas. The thing is, baseball admitted it knew nothing about Diamond doing this, about Diamond canceling the broadcasts, until the Diamond lawyer said so in court. We were sandbagged, said baseball's lawyer, which if you know anything about how baseball is run under its commissioner Rob Manfred, should not surprise you in the least. The other thing is, of the 11 now homeless TV-less clubs, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, and Milwaukee constitute 1/3 of all the teams in this year's baseball playoffs. These are the successful teams losing their TV homes because baseball on TV is dying, because baseball has completely screwed up its business model, because baseball has emphasized making money today rather than giving up a little of it to push and market interest in the game as a whole, so that maybe you will watch a game even if it is not your team playing, or even if you don't have a bet down on the damn teams playing. The third thing is, the people behind all this are from Sinclair Broadcasting. If that name sounds familiar, it should. It's the biggest bunch of conservative propagandist, Trumpist crap hounds going. And so if the fans of the Guardians, Rangers, Twins, Angels, Reds, Tigers, Royals, Marlins, Brewers, Cardinals, and Rays need to blame somebody, blame the far right and its bottomless pit of greed and self-interest. They'll do something. They'll be on TV next year, but right now, those teams have the identical TV contracts as do the Altoonas of the 1884 Union Association. Altoona had a Major League Baseball team. Altoona, Pennsylvania. And by the way, baseball, also while we're here, congratulations on putting those garish, greedy, ugly ads on the playoff batting helmets like you said you would. Special congratulations on placing them just perfectly on the side of the helmets so that they are almost always totally obscured by the reflection off the lights in all the stadiums. So we can't read the name of the advertiser. So with the light streaks over it, the advertiser's name in big block letters looks like it's E-Fooey. E-F-O-O-E-E. E-Fooey. Leading manufacturer of beard curlers in the Midwest, I believe. Brought to you by E-Fooey. Vitajex. Why don't you do ads for Vitajex? Get that Vitajex feeling, Lonesome Roads. The runner-up, worser, speaking of bottomless pits of greed. There's Fox News, and we all know about its greed and its self-interest, but often we overlook the fact that Fox News teams with stupid people. I mean, with a name like Olbermann, I'm actually reluctant to mock almost any other name in human language, but for God's sake, if you were a newscaster and your last name was spelled A-S-M-A-N, would you change it? I mean, I thought about changing Olbermann when I was still in college. I went on the air once as Keith Owen, and it sounded so stupid, I went, screw it. I don't mind the name. But I mean, if your name was A-S-M-A-N, would you change it? I know he pronounces it Asman, but good grief, it looks like Assman. As in, good evening, I'm David Assman with behind-the-scenes info. David Assman just is not bright, as that choice would suggest. Britt Hume, the oldest and absolutely not the wisest of the Fox fascists, praised the work of the disgraced sexual harassment and abuse king, Mark Halperin, who had criticized CBS fact-checking in the VP debate because, as Halperin knows from the end of his career, truth is fatal to evil bastards like Trump and Hume and Mark Halperin. By the way, you know how old Britt Hume is? He's 206. In any event, Hume screenshotted some of Halperin's bitter new fascism, his revenge against the left-wing media world that he thinks shunned him, when in fact Halperin is lucky he's not serving a life sentence for his actions. Anyway, finally to the point. David Assman responded to Hume praising this dick Halperin by saying Halperin was, quote, again, this is Assman writing, one of the few who could write truly great books like A Soldier of the Great War and also do great journalism. Sadly, no. A Soldier of the Great War is a book written by Mark Halperin, H-E-L-P-R-I-N, who has never been Mark Halperin, H-A-L-P-E-R-I-N. Mark Halperin, who has never been accused of greeting fellow employees at ABC News while he wasn't wearing any pants. Apparently, David Assman just assumed Mark Halperin, bad guy, and Mark Halperin, good guy, are the same person. Because David Assman is a dedicated newsman who can't tell his ass man from his elbow man. Which is the perfect segue to the winner, the worst, Chris effing Cuomo. Holy crap. The disgraced ex-CNN anchor has dropped down to the ranks of the Nick at Night of News, News Nation, the retirement home for ex-newscasters, where management tells them, no, you still have viewers. You still have an audience. If you didn't, why would we have all these lights on in here? This is a network which has nearly as many viewers as this podcast has listeners. Chris Cuomo, desperate, broken, addressed the VP debate moment where J.B. Vance uttered the immortal words, "The rules were you guys weren't going to fact check." The debate equivalent of, "You're not allowed to stop me from lying." Cuomo explained, no, Vance wasn't lying. Quote, Vance wanted to correct something about how Haitians got into this country, and he was right. Cuomo then played the clip in which Vance lied again about the legal status of the Haitians and again pushed the lie that nearly got a Trump-loving MAGA family in Ohio killed because the father in that family defended his Haitian immigrant employees in Springfield, Ohio. And then Cuomo came back from the bite and said, well, there you have it. And look, Vance was right. Okay, there's nuance to it, but the bigger problem was, why was he moved on? We've got so much to get to. Says who? You know what I mean? What is the schedule here? So you have a list of topics? That's not what it's about. It's about how the American people can access these two men and the two theories and the narratives, and you got to let them have speak because now you created a story where you're the problem. Well, number one, no, you don't have to let them have speak if one of them is just lying and trying to get people killed. You don't have to let that happen. Maybe if you knew that, Chris, you might still be working at CNN or ABC. and not at News Nation. News Nation is the smallest nation in the world. In television terms, it's Luxembourg. And the other thing is Vance was not right. Vance's argument is that laws were waived to allow these immigrants to come here and stay here, which means they're here legally. And that if he and Trump are elected, they will enforce those laws in different ways. And these people who are here legally now suddenly will not be here legally, and they will be guilty of not being here legally, and they will be deported. And in the interim, Vance's argument, his narrative, as this buffoon Cuomo calls it, is that the immigrants are eating cats and dogs, and if MAGA psychopaths want to go to Ohio and threaten them, or threaten or kill those defending them, or in this case, threaten or kill the 14-year-old daughters of those defending them, that's fine by him because he's J.V. Vance, snake oil salesman. This is what Chris Cuomo claims is nuance, and Vance being right. Now, it's two theories, and now, all of a sudden, on top of all of this, we're supposed to listen to Chris Cuomo about journalistic ethics and political ethics, when Chris Cuomo's response to his brother's corruption as governor of New York was to ignore it on the air, or to cover it up on the air, and then privately offer media advice to his brother. And when CNN finally figured out Chris Cuomo was destroying their credibility on this vital story, instead of taking him off their network, or at least putting somebody else on the air for a few minutes every night on his show to cover the Andrew Cuomo scandals, so Chris Cuomo didn't have to do it, CNN's answer to this was to just have Chris Cuomo never mention the story at all, which was a passive-aggressive way of downplaying the scandal even further and letting Andrew Cuomo get away with it a little bit more. But sure, Chris, you tell me what's right and wrong here. The statute of limitations on being right and wrong has surely elapsed since 2020, hasn't it? Maybe you'll get it right this time, since this one doesn't involve any of your own relatives. I've mentioned before that the desire to be on television, especially when it comes to doing the news, is a psychological illness. I confess, if you recognize this, you're probably still in control. If you don't, and it becomes not a desire, but a need to be on TV, you wind up going on a channel that is propaganda for the far right, dressed up as independent journalism that nobody watches, and you start spouting excuses for Trump and Vance and the rest of the fascists, excuses so nauseating that if your father were still alive to hear it, he'd slap you in the face. This is where Chris Cuomo is. That and the fact that by looking at the tape of him saying this last night 3 or 4 times, I constituted a measurable percentage of his audience. Chris Cuomo, who is prostituting himself and whatever he thinks he used to stand for, today's worst person in the world. And now to the number one story on the countdown and my favorite topic. Me and I saw her on TV recently, so I flashed back and shuddered all over again. Yes, it's things I promised not to tell. I suspect that until the day I actually die, no day will have started so well with such promise, yet ended so badly with such a clanging thud as Wednesday, July 27th, 2011 did. Near midnight, 2 nights earlier, I had just entered my New York apartment back from a New York Yankees game when the last landline telephone I ever owned began to ring. Hi, Keith, it's Uma. Yeah. How many Umas could there be? It was the actress Uma Thurman. We had texted briefly. We had never met. We had never spoken. We spoke for 90 minutes, and she was self-deprecating and vulnerable and razor-sharp and warm, and she invited me to coffee on the afternoon of D-Day, Wednesday, July 27th, 2011. One of the producers I had hired to do the new version of Countdown on Al Gore's network, Current TV, happened to know Uma Thurman from the gym Erica Ferrari was her name, and she was great, and she and Uma Thurman had become close enough that Uma had unloaded all her relationship issues on Erica, and the next thing I knew, Erica was in my office explaining to me that when she explained to Uma where she worked and with whom, Uma said, "The Keith Olbermann?" And now I was being set up for drinks or dinner or coffee or something with Uma Thurman. So this seemed like a good day. Then 2 nights earlier, we had finally had this marvelous, warm conversation, and Uma Thurman had suggested coffee on Wednesday at 2:30 or so in one of the 2 or 3 places in Midtown near my studio, and she'd text me with details, and she couldn't wait. Simultaneously with this, the CEO of the Current TV network, Mark Rosenthal, called me up and invited me to dinner on Wednesday, July 27th, 2011. Going to be a busy day. Al Gore and Current had hired me even before I left MSNBC. That was what that was all about. And I had met and gotten to know everybody in the organization over the following 6 months before we finally got the show on the air in June. We got off to a good start, even though Current TV was available only in low-def digital cable. On its first night, Countdown on Current beat both MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell show and CNN's Elliot Spitzer show in the so-called demo ratings, measuring viewers aged 18 to 54. But by July 27th, 2011, so like 2 months later, it was evident to me that the network was run by 4 kinds of people. 1, the CEO, Rosenthal, who used to be at MTV and knew what he was doing. 2, some dilettantes who did not know how to plug in a television, let alone put stuff on one. 3, co-owner Al Gore, who meant well, but who had absolutely no judgment when it came to business partners. And 4, in a class by himself, Gore's business partner, Joel Hyatt, who had made one superb business decision in 1977 that earned him billions of dollars, and he sold everything, and then it earned him billions of dollars again. But he had literally never gotten anything right since 1977, while at the same time thinking he had never gotten anything wrong since 1977. He was a liberal. Unfortunately, he was a liberal Donald Trump. What was worse was that of all these people, only Mark Rosenthal understood how ruinously incompetent Joel Hyatt really was. Rosenthal had been president of MTV from 1996 through 2004, and whatever you thought of all those reality shows and The Real World and stuff like that, they were successes. He knew what he was doing, and he knew Joel Hyatt didn't. And Mark Rosenthal had invited me to dinner as soon as my show was over on Wednesday night, July 27th, 2011, about 7 hours after I was scheduled to have coffee with Uma Thurman as a dry run for a date. And Rosenthal told me he had figured out how we could, in effect, take control of the Current TV network away from this Joel Hyatt, and not only exploit the good start Countdown had made, but build on it and make Current TV into the liberal news network we had been intending to create and knew would be a success. Dinner would be our chance for him to explain it to me, to hatch our plan. It was a big, big day. I think, without me going into detail, you intuitively get the Uma Thurman part of what July 27th, 2011 was supposed to be, but I need to put a little bit more meat on the bones of why it was so important at Current TV. This is who this guy Hyatt was. That same producer who was doing her best to set up Uma Thurman and me, Erica. She walked in one day, white as the sheet of paper she was carrying, at arm's length as if it had been printed in bubonic plague. She had found, while surfing around Internet archives, a New York Times article about this Joel Hyatt, an article from April 13, 1990. You remember the movie Philadelphia, where the evil head of the law firm, portrayed by the actor Jason Robards, had fired the head of his Philadelphia office, played by Tom Hanks, because the Hanks character had AIDS? And Hanks' character got, as his lawyer, a character played by Denzel Washington? Well, this guy who co-owned Current TV with Al Gore, he was the Jason Robards character. He had fired from his law firm, Hyatt Legal Services, the head of his Philadelphia office, Clarence B. Kane, after finding out Clarence B. Kane had AIDS. In fact, reality was actually worse than the Philadelphia movie. In real life, Clarence B. Kane was also African American. The Times story that Erica Ferrari handed me, like it was printed on razor blades, recounted how a federal judge had not only ordered Hyatt Legal Services to pay Mr. Cain $157,000 plus costs, but how it had ordered them to pay him immediately, like in the next couple days. This was harrowing enough, but the final paragraph made my head swim. Quote, "What pained him most," Mr. Hyatt said, was the notion that his firm discriminated. He noted how it had, after all, named a gay black man to run one of its major offices, something no law firm its size has ever knowingly done. Quote, "What's totally lost in the shuffle is that this is an organization in which anyone can succeed," he said. "No one has written about that." That was this guy Hyatt in a nutshell. He fired a gay black man who was dying of AIDS, but he knew who the real victim here was: himself. And it's not like Hyatt had improved over the years. As I mentioned, the night Countdown premiered on Current TV, June 20th, 2011. We beat MSNBC and CNN in the ratings, but we didn't know it. The next day, our ratings showed that we had beaten CNN and just missed beating O'Donnell on MSNBC. A few weeks later, one of those networks got a friendly reporter to write a story about how, since the debut, our ratings on Current had sunk, which was to be expected and which was a totally legitimate competitive thing for the MSNBC guys to do. But the numbers were all wrong. The ratings for Countdown that were included in the pro-CNN, pro-MSNBC story were somehow higher than the ratings we saw every day at Current. If I'm not clear about this, the story said that, say, on Monday, July 11th, we had 100,000 demo viewers. But our ratings, the ratings we got from the Nielsen Company, they said that on Monday, July 7th, we didn't have 100,000 demo viewers. We only had 75,000 demo viewers. Well, something was really, really wrong here. So when Hyatt called me for our weekly phone chat, I said, look, there's something wrong with the ratings. And I explained the article to him, and he said, oh, I knew they were going to do that. Show how your ratings had dropped. And I said, no, you're missing my point. They say we had higher ratings than we actually did. Oh, I knew they were going to do that too, he said with even more condescension. And I said, why would they do that? Why would they try to make us look better? Oh, I knew they were going to do that too, just to... Then there was a long pause while Joel Hyatt made something up. Just to mess with us. I asked him, since he had personally purchased the ratings package from the Nielsen Company, the first ratings in the history of Current TV, if he could just review for me what he remembered of the process. Well, I went in and made an excellent deal. I saved $2,000 on their initial price point. This man was worth a couple $2 billion. They wanted us to buy not just the live ratings, but something called Live plus Diver. I thought for a moment. Diver? I said. You mean Live plus DVR? He laughed. Yes, that's it. Diver. What the hell is Diver? You just use the live ratings in TV. Everybody knows that. I explained to him that Diver ratings were comparatively new, about 3-4 years old at that point. They added to the live rating people who would watch the show on their DVR within 24 hours of having recorded it. He had bought the ratings that did not include all of those people, so that when we got what we thought were our ratings for our premiere night, when we beat CNN and almost beat MSNBC but just missed, we didn't just miss. The ratings package this idiot Hyatt had bought did not include anybody who watched the show on their DVRs. And that cost us the chance to come out and say, we beat CNN and MSNBC the first night with this crappy low-def picture down on channel 103. But more importantly, it saved this billionaire idiot Hyatt $2,000. So, Mark Rosenthal was taking me to dinner hours after I was to have coffee with Uma Thurman to explain how we could get rid of this idiot who thought DVR meant Diver. Thus was July 27th, 2011, going to be one of the turning points in my life. And then, about 1:45, just when Uma said she was going to text me to tell me where to meet her for coffee, she texted me all right. She texted me to explain her rehearsal was running long and she had to postpone. And while I was reading between those lines and knowing that that actually meant she was going back with her boyfriend or her husband or whoever he was, a company email came into all of our inboxes. And even before I opened it, I could hear mass groaning coming from my newsroom. Mark Rosenthal, 7 hours before our dinner to plot how to root around Joel Divers / Jason Robards in Philadelphia / I saved $2,000 Hyatt, Mark Rosenthal had been fired. And he'd been replaced as CEO of Current TV, effective immediately by co-owner Joel Hyatt. Well, holy diver. It'd be a better story if I never saw Mark Rosenthal or Uma Thurman again in my life, but it wouldn't be true. I saw Mark many times, and then 4 years later, I was at a New York recording studio doing the voice of the newsman character, Tom Jumbo Grumbo, on the great animated series BoJack Horseman, when one of the other studio doors opened and out stepped Uma Thurman. Radiant, elegant. I introduced myself. She smiled. She said she was a fan. She laughed, and she said, "You know, we must have coffee sometime." Diver? What the hell is Diver? I saved $11. Oh my God, what a mistake that was. Not leaving MSNBC. I had to leave MSNBC. And not taking the money. I like the money. But boy, was this guy an idiot. I've done all the damage I can do here. Thank you for listening. We're now back to 5 episodes a week, posting nightly just after midnight Eastern. Once again, there is a Monday countdown. Please send this podcast to somebody who doesn't listen but should. And as I bash Chris Cuomo's audience relative to the size of this podcast has a larger audience than Countdown on Current TV had. Brian Ray and John Philip Chanel, the musical directors of Countdown, arranged, produced, and performed most of our music, and they update it continuously. Mr. Chanel handled orchestration and keyboards. Mr. Ray was on the guitars, bass, drums, and musical innovations. It was produced by TKO Brothers. Our satirical and pithy musical comments are by the best baseball stadium organist ever, Nancy Faust. The sports music is the Olbermann theme from ESPN2. It was written by Mitch Warren Davis, courtesy of ESPN Inc. Other music arranged and performed by the group No Horns Allowed. My announcer today was my friend Stevie Van Zandt. Everything else was pretty much my fault. That's Countdown for today, 4 weeks and 5 days until the 2024 presidential election and the 1,367th day since convicted felon drooling J. Trump's first attempted coup against the democratically elected government of the United States. Use the election. Use the Jack Smith filing. Use the mental health system. Use presidential immunity if we have to keep him from doing it again. While we still can. The next scheduled countdown is tomorrow. Bulletins as the news requires. Till the next one, I'm Keith Olbermann. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, and good luck.